You can't park that Rustbucket here. This is a military funeral, not a junkyard showcase." The words rang out across the Arlington Cemetery parking lot like a slap across the face. Harsh, unprovoked, unforgiving. Harold Langston paused mid-step, his gnarled hand resting on the door of his weathered blue pickup truck. The paint had long since faded, the edges crusted with rust. The flag sticker on the back window had begun to peel, its colors bleached by years of sun. But the plates were regulation, the permit was visible, and most importantly, Harold had been invited. "I'm sorry, sir. Did I break a rule?" he asked, his voice steady, measured, not out of fear, but out of decades of learning how quickly a man like him could be painted as a threat. The young white officer, Corporal Travis Monroe, crossed his arms. His mirrored sunglasses reflected the morning sun, hiding his eyes, but not his disdain. "Your vehicle's an eyesore. We're expecting dignitaries. This is General Maddox's funeral. The brass don't need to see some hillbilly rig parked out front." The term stung more than Harold let show. Hillbilly. Rustbucket. Just like that, his decades of service, of sacrifice, were reduced to surface judgments. A truck, a jacket too old, a face too wrinkled. From behind Monroe, another soldier shifted awkwardly. Private Simmons, younger, nervous. His eyes darted between Monroe and Harold, clearly unsure. "Sir, if you could just move your vehicle around the side, we can direct you to the overflow lot." Harold nodded slowly, jaw tightening. Fine. He backed the truck into the gravel beyond the tree line. No shade, no pavement, just dry weeds and heat. He reached for his cane, an old hickory branch he'd sanded himself, and stepped out with deliberate dignity. Each step was slow but certain. His chest still bore the weight of 3 tours. His lungs still carried the dust of Fallujah, and his heart still remembered every man he lost under his command. He had come today not for recognition, but to honor a friend. General Thomas Maddox. They had served together in '91. Maddox had gone on to command armies. Harold had retired quietly, tending a farm, raising 2 sons, burying 1. He had received the invite to the funeral in the mail, no titles, just "To Sergeant Major Harold Langston, retired. It would be an honor if you would attend." And yet, here he was, dismissed, diminished, disrespected. He moved through the cemetery path slowly, following the trail of polished boots and fresh medals. Mourners gathered near the central rotunda, where flags fluttered at half-mast and a full brass band rehearsed quietly beneath the oaks. Harold remained at the edge, unseen. The ceremony began promptly at 1100 hours. Bugles, gun salute, eulogies from generals who'd never set foot in a foxhole. Their words were polished, professional, hollow. No one mentioned the Maddox Harold knew, the Maddox who once dragged him out from under burning wreckage in the middle of the Kuwaiti desert, the Maddox who mailed letters to Harold's wife when he was in critical condition, the Maddox who drank coffee from tin cups and listened more than he spoke. Harold listened quietly. When they called for those who had served with the general to stand and salute, he rose slowly, bringing his hand to his brow with precise reverence. But Monroe noticed. "Hey, you, sir, guests only past this line." Several heads turned. Harold stood his ground. "I served with General Maddox. I've been invited." "Yeah, you got proof of that?" Harold slowly reached into his coat pocket, producing a folded card. The invitation, embossed, signed. Monroe took it, scanned it. scoffed. Could be fake. These things get passed around. And then, from behind, a new voice cut through the tension. Corporal Monroe, stand down. The voice was calm, deep, commanding. Major General Rebecca Hayes stepped forward, her uniform crisp, her medals gleaming. Sergeant Major Langston is a decorated veteran. He commanded Maddox's forward operations in Desert Storm. Without him, there would be no Maddox. She turned to Harold. Sir, I apologize. On behalf of this branch and this nation, your seat is not back here. It's at the front, with the family. Monroe stiffened, his face pale. Harold said nothing. He simply nodded and walked forward to the front, to his rightful place. Harold sat in the front row, flanked by a row of polished shoes and pristine dress uniforms. A respectful hush followed his arrival, the murmur of recognition rippling back through the seated ranks like a breeze across tall grass. Major General Hayes leaned in. I remember the stories, she said softly. My father served under Maddox in the early years. He talked about you often. Harold looked straight ahead, voice dry. Funny how the people who remember are never the ones holding the gate. Hayes gave a grim smile. That's changing. The service pressed on. A 3-star general stepped up to the podium, recounting Maddox's final years, his diplomatic missions, his role in restructuring post-9/11 logistics. It was a long, formal list, delivered with polish. But Harold heard only fragments. His eyes were fixed on the casket. Not just for the man inside, but for what it represented. The passing of an era. The quiet burying of a kind of leadership that didn't ask for applause, that knew men by name, not rank, that sent letters, that sat beside the dying, that kept promises. As the eulogies ended and the flag was folded with care, Harold rose once more, his cane trembling beneath his grip. He stepped forward when asked to share memories. For a moment, the microphone loomed like an obstacle, but Hayes was beside him. You don't have to speak like them, she said. Just say what you know. Harold nodded, adjusted the mic with calloused fingers. I knew Tom Maddox before he had stars on his shoulders, he began. He didn't wear rank, he earned it. And he never made you feel less for having fewer stripes. He was the kind of man who carried water cans when the truck broke down, who shared the last can of beans without a word. He paused. The silence gave room for memory. But more than that, he remembered birthdays. He asked about your kids. He listened. There was a crack in his voice, a thin line of grief stretching across the quiet. He saved my life twice, once in battle, once after, when the war had come home in my sleep. I sent him letters I never mailed. I thought, maybe I'd say thank you here. He looked down at the casket, then stepped back. No applause, just the weight of truth. As the service drew to a close, the family stood to accept condolences. The eldest son, Colonel Thomas Maddox, Jr., approached Harold directly. You're the man from the photo, he said, pulling a folded image from his coat. Dad kept this in his wallet. Said you were the best man he ever served with. Said you taught him everything that mattered. Harold took the photo gently. It was them, young, laughing, covered in dust and oil and blood and grit. Survivors. He said nothing, just stared. Hayes approached again. "The brass want to talk to you. I told them they could wait. You deserve to eat first. Come with me." She led him to the officer's tent. As they approached, Monroe stood at attention by the entrance. His posture was rigid, his eyes averted. Shame radiated from every inch of him. Harold stopped. "Corporal," he said. Monroe looked up, startled. "You were doing your job. I get it. But next time, see the man, not the rust." Monroe swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." Harold nodded and stepped inside. There, seated around a long table, were 3 generals, 2 senators, and the Secretary of the Army. They rose when he entered. Hayes gestured. "This is the man who trained Maddox, the man who never asked for medals, the man we forgot." And then, for the first time in a long time, Harold Langston sat not at the edge, not at the back, but at the center of the table. And he was ready to speak. "He doesn't belong here, not among them." The voice came from a sharply dressed man in his 40s, his medals gleaming under the fluorescent lights of the officer's tent. His words sliced through the quiet reverence like a blade. Hayes turned slowly. "Excuse me?" "That man, Langston," he sneered. "He was enlisted. Why is he in here? This tent is for generals and command staff." The air grew thick. Monroe froze. Maddox's widow clutched her son tighter. Harold Langston said nothing. He simply looked at the man, not with anger, but with something deeper, disappointment. Hayes stepped forward. "You think a commission makes you worthy of this space? That a stripe or a star outrank sacrifice? You weren't even alive when Langston saved your right to wear that uniform." The man stiffened. "With respect, ma'am, tradition matters." "So does honor," she snapped. Then Harold finally spoke. "Son, I led men into fire who didn't care what I wore on my collar. They cared if I brought them home." Silence. Heavy, unflinching. Then a voice from behind, an old general with a white mustache and a cane. "Langston once pulled me from a burning APC in Basra. He has more right to stand in this tent than any of us." More murmurs. Faces changed. Postures shifted. Monroe stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Gentlemen, we're all here to honor Colonel Maddox, a man who served under Langston. If Maddox were here, he'd be standing beside him." The man who had objected swallowed hard, then offered a short, stiff nod. Not an apology, but a retreat. Langston gave him a single, solemn glance. "Next time you question who belongs, ask yourself what they've carried and who they carried home." The tent fell quiet. Outside, the wind shifted, flags snapped. And inside, Sergeant Major Harold Langston stood in the middle of the officer's tent, not as an intruder, but as its moral compass. The Secretary of the Army leaned forward, hands clasped on the table. "Sergeant Major Langston, we owe you more than we can express." Harold glanced at the rows of faces seated before him. Generals, senators, aides, uniforms with ribbons, civilians in suits, eyes trained on him, not with skepticism or dismissal, but a kind of reverence he hadn't felt in decades. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he let the weight of silence speak first. Hayes finally broke it. "We'd like your perspective on everything: command, retention, mental health, legacy, what we are and what we've lost." Harold reached for the glass of water in front of him, his hand slow but steady. "You're asking the wrong question." Eyebrows lifted. "You don't need my perspective. You need to admit you forgot the people who built the foundation you're standing on." A slow shift in the room. No defensiveness, just realization. Harold looked directly at the secretary. "Do you know how many men I buried with no flag, no ceremony, no next of kin? You think legacy is medals? Legacy is what people say about you when the speeches are over, when the band stops playing." He pointed to Hayes. "That one remembers. She listens. That's rare. You want to fix the culture? Start by remembering your builders." The room sat in stillness. Hayes stood. "We have a proposal, a leadership initiative, a mentorship program for young officers led by veterans. We want you to help design it." Harold tilted his head. "Not a mouthpiece. No, a cornerstone." He considered, then nodded once. Monroe, who had been silently stationed outside, stepped in to escort Harold back to the reception area. "Sir," Monroe said quietly, "I read your file, your unit, what you did in '91. I was wrong." Harold placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Learn from it, and teach better. That's all any of us can do." The next morning, a brief but powerful headline ran in the Washington Post. "Forgotten Hero Honored at Arlington. Sergeant Major Harold Langston Leads Change in Military Culture." Photos from the funeral circulated wildly. The image of Harold saluting at the front row, of Maddox's son embracing him, of Hayes escorting him into the officer's tent. Veterans across the country wrote in. Letters, emails, calls, some angry, most grateful. He received a handwritten letter from a young lieutenant in Alaska. "I never knew the name of the man whose photo hung in our mess hall until yesterday. Thank you." Another from a widow in Kansas. "My husband served under you. He said your quiet courage saved more men than your rifle ever did." And then one more, simple, from a soldier stationed in Germany. "You remind me what I want to become." Harold sat in his small kitchen 2 days later, coffee brewing, the sun rising over the Virginia fields. The folded flag from Maddox's casket rested on his mantel. Next to it, an old photograph. 2 young men in dust-covered uniforms, arms around each other, laughing. His phone rang. It was Hayes. "It begins next week," she said. "First group of young officers. You in?" "I'll be there," he said. He hung up, then rose, slowly but steadily, with the strength of legacy behind every step. She asked, "Any regrets?" Harold didn't answer at first. He simply looked across the fields of white stones, the hush of wind rustling through the rows. Then, "No, not anymore." 2 weeks later, Harold passed quietly in his sleep.
He was buried with full honors beside Maddox. Hayes gave the eulogy. He taught us that legacy isn't a parade. It's the quiet echo of doing right long after the crowd has gone home. At the service, Monroe, now a first lieutenant, stood at attention, tears in his eyes. And in bases across the world, soldiers paused, not for a holiday, but for a man who reminded them what leadership really means. The sun rose high that day and stayed bright long into the afternoon, because for once the world had remembered the quiet ones, and it would never forget again.